June 23, 1942. At Pembrey airfield in South Wales, Royal Air Force spotters peered through their binoculars. They were watching a German fighter, a sleek machine, descend from the clouds. It was lining up as if to land. Sirens should have been blaring. Anti-aircraft guns should have been trained on the enemy aircraft, following its every move. But something about the pilot's approach just didn't seem right. The Focke-Wulf 190 touched down with surprising ease on the grass runway. It rolled to a stop near the control tower. The engine went silent. The canopy slid open, and Oberleutnant Armin Faber of Jägerschwader II climbed out of the cockpit. He removed his leather helmet and looked around at the unfamiliar buildings. A wave of realization, cold and sharp, washed over him. The aircraft parked on the flight line weren't Messerschmitts. They were Spitfires. The uniforms of the figures running toward him weren't Luftwaffe gray. They were Royal Air Force blue. The understanding that dawned on Faber in that instant was the same one that was simultaneously hitting British intelligence officers all across southern England. Germany's most deadly fighter, the plane that had been decimating Allied pilots for months, that mysterious new weapon that seemed invincible in combat, had just been delivered, intact, to Britain. And it was delivered by a pilot who had become disoriented and mistakenly thought he was landing in France. The intelligence bonanza was immense, almost unbelievable. But what American test pilots would find when they finally got their hands on this aircraft would fundamentally change how every Allied fighter engaged German aircraft for the remainder of the war. For 8 long months, the Focke-Wulf 190 had been a terrifying presence, a nightmare haunting Allied pilots over the English Channel. It had first appeared in combat over France in September of 1941. From its very first engagement, pilots knew they were facing something completely different, something extraordinarily dangerous. Royal Air Force Squadron Leader J.E. Johnson, who would later become Britain's top-scoring ace, encountered the FW-190 in early 1942 and barely managed to escape with his life. "It was faster than our Spitfire Mark Vs in level flight and in the dive," he later wrote. "It could outroll us." This firepower was devastating. For the first time in the war, our fighters were comprehensively outclassed. The cold, hard statistics only confirmed the terror. In the first 6 months of 1942, RAF fighter losses over France increased dramatically. Experienced pilots, men who had survived the Battle of Britain, were being shot down by an aircraft they simply couldn't match in any way. The FW-190 could easily dive away from pursuing Spitfires, outroll them in any turning combat, and destroy them with cannons that fired powerful 20mm explosive shells. American pilots arriving in Britain with their P-47 Thunderbolts were immediately given stern warnings. Don't engage the 190 in turning combat. Don't try to outroll it. Don't get into a dive competition. The list of what not to do was long and discouraging. The list of what would work was frighteningly short. Intelligence desperately needed answers. What made this aircraft so incredibly effective? What were its limitations? And, most importantly, how could Allied fighters possibly counter it? But getting those crucial answers required examining an actual FW-190. Every example that had been shot down over Britain had been far too damaged to reveal its secrets. And then Armin Faber made his catastrophic mistake. Before we continue this account, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about the FW-190. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've heard this story before, and if you appreciate this level of historical detail. I hope you'll subscribe to the channel. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Oberleutnant Armin Faber was not an inexperienced, green pilot. At just 21 years old, he had already achieved multiple aerial victories and was considered a highly skilled member of Jägerschwader II, the elite Richthofen fighter wing. On June 23, 1942, he was flying as part of a fighter sweep over the English Channel, providing top cover and protection for German bombers that were attacking coastal targets. The mission had proceeded smoothly enough until the return flight. Somewhere over the channel, during some aggressive maneuvering while engaging British fighters, Faber became completely disoriented. Heavy cloud cover obscured the coastline, making it impossible to get his bearings. The position of the sun gave him false directional cues, further confusing him. Then, when he broke through the clouds and saw a stretch of green countryside with an airfield below, his mind made a simple, but devastating assumption. He thought he was over France, looking at a Luftwaffe base. He was, in reality, over Wales approaching RAF Pembrey. The mistake seems almost unbelievable in hindsight, but combat disorientation was far more common than military authorities like to admit. Pilots flying at high speeds through thick clouds, pulling high-G maneuvers that affected blood flow to the brain, sometimes completely lost their sense of direction. Faber had inadvertently made a 180-degree turn during the dogfight and simply hadn't realized it. When he landed and saw the Spitfires, Faber desperately attempted to restart his engine and take off again, but RAF personnel were already swarming the aircraft. Within minutes, he was in custody, and British intelligence officers were eagerly examining the pristine Focke-Wulf 190 sitting right there on their runway. The immediate reaction at RAF headquarters bordered on pure euphoria. Air Chief Marshal Sholto Douglas, commanding RAF Fighter Command, immediately ordered the captured aircraft to be transported to the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough for comprehensive testing. Every single aspect of the machine was to be meticulously documented, precisely measured, and thoroughly analyzed. Within 48 hours, the FW-190 was at Farnborough, being carefully inspected by Britain's top aviation engineers. What they discovered finally explained everything Allied pilots had been experiencing in combat. The aircraft was, without a doubt, a masterpiece of practical engineering. While the Spitfire represented elegant, refined aerodynamic design, the FW-190 embodied brutal, functional efficiency. Its BMW 801 radial engine produced a staggering 1,700 horsepower, compared to the Spitfire Mark V's 1,470. But raw power wasn't the whole story, not by a long shot. The FW-190's most devastating advantage was its incredible roll rate. The aircraft could snap from one bank to the other faster than any Allied fighter in the sky. This seemingly minor characteristic was actually revolutionary in combat. When a Spitfire tried to follow an FW-190 through a series of rolling maneuvers, the British fighter simply couldn't keep up. The German pilot could effortlessly reverse direction, gain advantageous angles, and line up his shots before the Allied pilot could even react. British test pilot Captain Eric Brown flew the captured FW-190 extensively and immediately understood exactly why Allied pilots were dying. The ailerons were light and responsive at all speeds, he reported. You could throw this aircraft around the sky with almost no effort. The Spitfire required both muscle and finesse. The FW-190 responded almost to thought. The firepower advantage was equally stunning. The FW-190A3 carried 4 20mm MG-151 cannons and 2 7.92mm machine guns. A 2-second burst delivered more explosive power than a Spitfire Mark V could generate in a full 10 seconds of firing. And the weapons were all mounted in the wings, close to the fuselage, creating an incredibly tight concentration pattern that was absolutely devastating at combat ranges. The dive performance explained how FW-190s consistently escaped pursuing Spitfires. The German fighter's heavier weight and cleaner aerodynamics meant that it could outdive anything the RAF was currently flying. Pilots who attempted to follow an FW-190 into a steep dive watched helplessly as the German aircraft rapidly pulled away and disappeared. But the testing also revealed crucial weaknesses. And this is where the intelligence value truly became strategic gold for the Allied forces. The FW-190's powerful radial engine, while impressive, created significant cooling problems at high altitudes. Above 20,000 feet, the aircraft's performance began to drop off dramatically. The engine struggled in the thinner air, and pilots reported significant losses of power and dangerous overheating issues. Meanwhile, the Spitfire's Merlin engine, specifically designed for high-altitude operation, actually performed better as altitude increased. The heavy weight that made the FW-190 a superior dive bomber also made it significantly less maneuverable in sustained turning combat. The aircraft could easily outroll a Spitfire, but it couldn't outturn one in a prolonged engagement. If an Allied pilot could somehow force an FW-190 into a sustained horizontal turn fight, the advantage shifted decisively. Most critically, American engineers discovered that the FW-190's controls became extremely heavy at high speeds. In a dive exceeding 400 miles per hour, the pilot needed significant physical strength to pull out. This created a vulnerable moment. If an Allied fighter could pursue an FW-190 through the initial dive and catch it during the critical pull-out phase, when the German pilot was struggling with his own controls, attacks became feasible. British intelligence immediately began distributing tactical bulletins to all RAF squadrons. But they also did something else that would prove to be absolutely crucial for the outcome of the air war. They invited American test pilots to Farnborough to fly the captured FW-190. In August of 1942, U.S. Army Air Forces pilots arrived at Farnborough to examine Germany's secret weapon firsthand. These pilots would return to American training bases armed with knowledge that would ultimately save hundreds of American lives. Major Cass Hoff, one of the first American pilots to fly the captured FW-190, filed a detailed report that was distributed to every fighter group preparing to deploy to Europe. His assessment was both blunt and tactical. The FW-190 will beat any Allied fighter below 20,000 feet if the German pilot knows what he's doing. Hoff wrote, "Our advantage is altitude. Above 25,000 feet, our P-47s and later model Spitfires have the edge. Force them high and we win. Let them dictate low-altitude combat and we die." This single piece of intelligence fundamentally changed American fighter tactics in Europe. When P-47 Thunderbolt units began operations in 1943, their doctrine emphasized high-altitude combat at all costs. Bomber escorts flew at maximum altitude. Fighter sweeps operated above 25,000 feet whenever possible. When German fighters attempted to engage, American pilots would immediately climb, forcing the FW-190s to follow into the thin air where their engines struggled to operate efficiently. The captured FW-190 also significantly influenced American aircraft development. Engineers at Wright Field studied the German aircraft's superior roll rate and began modifying P-47 and P-51 ailerons to improve their responsiveness. The FW-190's gun placement informed American thinking about weapons concentration. Even the cockpit layout, which German designers had meticulously optimized for combat efficiency, influenced American fighter design. But perhaps the most important lesson came from understanding that the FW-190 was not invincible. It was, without a doubt, an excellent aircraft, but it had specific advantages and, crucially, exploitable weaknesses. Allied pilots, who had been psychologically intimidated by the 190's fearsome reputation now, had concrete information about how to effectively fight it and win. By late 1943, the tactical situation had shifted dramatically. American P-47s and P-51s were engaging FW-190s at high altitude, where Allied fighters held a distinct advantage. RAF Spitfire Mark IXs, with their upgraded Merlin engines, could match the FW-190's performance across most altitude ranges. Pilots on both sides understood that they were flying different aircraft, each optimized for different conditions. The kill ratios began to shift decisively in the Allies' favor. FW-190 losses climbed steadily as American and British pilots exploited the critical intelligence gained from Faber's captured aircraft. German pilots noticed that Allied fighters were no longer making the tactical mistakes that had given the FW-190 its early dominance. Oberleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, a high-scoring FW-190 ace, commented in late 1943 that American pilots had clearly studied the aircraft in detail. "They know not to follow us into rolling scissors. They force us high where our engines labor. They've learned," he wrote in his combat journal. The captured FW-190 remained at Farnborough throughout the war, serving as a crucial reference aircraft for evaluating new German variants as they appeared. When the FW-190D9 Dora, with its inline engine, appeared in late 1944, Allied intelligence immediately compared it to Faber's captured aircraft, gaining a critical understanding of how German designers had addressed the original's high-altitude limitations. After the war, aviation historians attempted to calculate the full impact of Faber's mistake. The intelligence gained from examining the intact FW-190 was shared with thousands of Allied pilots through tactical bulletins, training films, and direct demonstration flights. This invaluable knowledge influenced aircraft development, tactical doctrine, and operational planning across multiple air forces. Captain Eric Brown, who flew more captured enemy aircraft than any other Allied pilot, would later write, "Faber's navigation error gave us the Rosetta Stone for understanding German fighter design. Every tactical advantage the FW-190 possessed was meticulously documented, and every weakness was ruthlessly exploited. That single aircraft probably saved more Allied lives than any other intelligence coup of the war." The irony was certainly not lost on German intelligence when they eventually learned what had happened. One Luftwaffe officer commented bitterly, "We spent months trying to capture a Spitfire Mark 9 intact so we could study its improvements. The British didn't have to try. We delivered our best fighter directly to them." Armin Faber spent the remainder of the war in a prisoner-of-war camp in Canada. He survived the war and returned to Germany, where he lived until 1976. Luftwaffe records suggest that he was initially blamed for the loss of the aircraft, but later assessments acknowledged that combat disorientation could happen to any pilot, regardless of skill or experience. The real question was why German intelligence had so confidently assumed that the British would never get their hands on an intact FW-190. The story of Faber's captured fighter teaches a crucial lesson about the nature of technological advantage in warfare. Germany's Focke-Wulf 190 represented a quantum leap in fighter design when it first appeared in 1941. For nearly a year, it completely dominated Allied aircraft through its superior performance and innovative engineering. But that advantage evaporated the instant Allied engineers were able to examine the actual machine. No aircraft is truly invincible. Every design inherently involves compromises and trade-offs. The FW-190's low-altitude dominance came at the significant cost of high-altitude performance. Its excellent roll rate came with heavy, less responsive high-speed controls. Its powerful armament added weight that reduced its overall maneuverability. Once Allied pilots understood these trade-offs, they were able to effectively exploit them. Today, the FW-190 is rightly remembered as one of World War II's great fighter designs. Aviation museums proudly display surviving examples as masterpieces of German engineering. But the aircraft's reputation is inseparable from the incredible intelligence coup that revealed its secrets. In the complex calculus of wartime advantage, one pilot's momentary disorientation over the English Channel turned Germany's secret weapon into an open book, available for all to study. The FW-190 that Armin Faber accidentally delivered to Britain became the aircraft that taught the Allies how to win the air war. The lesson echoes through military history. Superior technology matters, of course, but superior intelligence matters even more. And sometimes the greatest victories come not from devastating attacks, but from simple mistakes that give your enemy exactly what they've been desperately seeking. The Focke-Wulf 190 could have remained a terrifying mystery, an invincible opponent that continued slaughtering Allied pilots through psychological advantage as much as technical superiority. Instead, it became a crucial teaching tool that every Allied pilot studied, learned from, and ultimately defeated. One navigation error, one landed aircraft, one intelligence windfall that changed the entire air war over Europe. That's how America got Germany's secret fighter. And that's how a single mistake shifted the balance of power in the skies.